Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I've been just looking at this book on American history because I have been concerned that some of you may feel that on this Sunday before Christmas is not an appropriate time to be discussing the serious and difficult problems of government. You will recall that some of the great documents we have dealt with in discussing government in the last few weeks are the documents of American history, like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution of the United States. But those documents were not the only facts. They were not unsupported by action. And as I'm reminding myself, I'd like to remind you of some of the facts that have a bearing on today many years ago. In fact, better than the facts, perhaps, is to remind you by showing you the pictures. You all remember, don't you, Gilbert Stuart's painting of Washington crossing the Delaware? That took place on December 25th, on the night of Christmas in 1776. And on the next day, George Washington, with a very small force, won the Battle of Trenton. And then, a year later, there's another picture I want you to look at with me. A year later, Christmas Day of 1777, George Washington was with his men at Valley Forge. In fact, a few days from now, in 1777, on December 23rd, George Washington wrote the following words: "We have this day no less than 2,873 men out of 11,000, 2,873 men unfit for duty because they are barefoot or otherwise naked. Numbers are still obliged to sit all night by the fire." And there's a third fact I'd like to remind you of. On December 23rd, in 1783, after having won a great revolution, George Washington, unlike other revolutionary leaders with an army behind him and a sword in his hand, turned that sword in to the Continental Congress assembled in Annapolis, Maryland, got up the next morning on the 24th and rode hard all day, and was back at Mount Vernon late on Christmas Eve. I think these facts indicate the kind of actions our forefathers took in this Christmas week for a government whose blessings we enjoy. And I myself think it's a lot easier to think about good government than to fight for it. At least that's the way it seems to me, and that probably is the peculiarity of a philosopher. Maybe some of you think it's easier to fight for it than think about it. As a matter of fact, there's another peculiarity that I fear I have as a philosopher. I take great pleasure in the simple truths about government that we have been learning in the last few weeks. Let me remind you of just 4 of them before we go on with today's problem. Here they are. First, that government is necessary so that men can live together and act together in society. Second, that the end of government is the peace of civil society and the general welfare. Third, this is one of my favorites as a matter of fact, that government must combine right and might, or authority and force, and that therefore it is aptly defined as a monopoly of authorized force. And fourth, that the sovereignty of government derives from the people who constitute the government. It is a government then of the people, or as the Declaration says, it derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. And it's this last proposition that brings us to today's problem. Not so simple as these truths I've just stated. In fact, a very difficult problem, and one that I feel you're going to have to stay with me carefully as I attempt to state the problem for you so that you can, I think, justly appraise it in all its difficulty. The problem is, what are the powers of government? How much power should government have? I warn you, this is not easy. And to help us discuss this, Mr. Luckman and I, Lloyd, how are you do? Mr. Luckman and I have decided that we're going to bring the questions in at the right place where they seem to fit into the discussion. Now let me begin this by stating the problem once again. The problem, as I see it, is the problem of power in the hands of men. Power that almost anyone feels it can be an enemy to the liberty which other men wish to enjoy, men who don't have that power. I'd like to show you a statement on one of these plaques on the wall here, a statement made on this very subject by Woodrow Wilson in a speech he made in New York in 1912. He said, read this with me, "The history of liberty is a history of the limitations of governmental power, not the increase of it. When we resist the concentration of power, we are resisting the powers of death, because the concentration of power is what always precedes the destruction of human liberty." And you will recall that Lord Acton, before Woodrow Wilson, said, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." In fact, it was against just such absolute power, the absolute power of George III, that our founding fathers, that men like George Washington and his ragged soldiers at Valley Forge fought that revolution because they wished to be emancipated, freed from such absolute power.
Dr. Adler?
Yes, Lloyd?
We have a question I think is particularly pertinent at this point. It's from Elizabeth Cronin. She lives in Oakland, California, and asks, if the people are the source of the government's sovereignty, where does an absolute monarch get his?
The answer is, almost in a word, he takes it. He doesn't get it. And this, by the way, Lloyd, really is the whole problem. Let me see if I can state the problem for you exactly in that way. Our whole problem of power, and that is our problem today, is a problem that can be divided into two parts. One is the problem of the power of men in government, and the other is the problem of the power of government itself. Now, I think this first problem we can solve. The one that I think is difficult, the one that I'm going to ask you to watch carefully as we deal with it, is the second problem down here, the problem of the power of government itself. Now, the reason why I think this problem can be solved is that largely it has been solved. It has been solved in two ways. First of all, that very question that we just considered, the question about the absolute power of an absolute monarch who does not get that power from the popular sovereignty of the people, connects in your mind, I'm sure, and in mine, with a famous statement of the basic division in kinds of government. Government is either government by laws, we are accustomed to say, or it is government by men. And when a government is government by laws, its power is limited, or the power of the men in government, rather, is limited. But when a government is government by men, the power of those men is unlimited. That's why we say that limited government, or government by laws, is constitutional government, and unlimited government, or government by men, is absolute government. Now, the Greeks, way, way back at the beginning of our civilization, the Greek city-states really gave us the first great invention of free government. I often like to think about this as an invention as important to human society and human happiness, human freedom, as the invention of the wheel is to mechanical progress. The Greeks invented, I can't use that word any more seriously, the Greeks invented a constitution. And what is a constitution, or a constitutional form of government? It consists in having all the citizens and the magistrates or office holders share in the sovereignty. It divides the sovereignty or the power into shares. And all the citizens share in the sovereignty, and more than the citizens, particularly the public offices, the offices of government. And what this means is, in a word, that men don't have power vested in themselves as persons. They have the power, they exercise the power that is vested in offices. They have a power that is authorized to the office, and they can exercise that power so long as they hold political office. That is the meaning of constitutional government, a government by office holders, each office having some authority and power vested in it, and the man having that power and authority just so long as he holds the office and no longer. That's the way the ancients solved the problem, but they didn't solve it completely. In fact, it was in the 18th century that the second stage in the solution took place. Our ancestors saw that the problem was not solved if men could misuse the power of public office, or if men holding offices could exceed their power, the power they had from the office they held. And so, the question was, how do you control the men who hold the power of office? Do you remember, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, that I quoted that famous sentence, if men were angels, no government would be necessary? Well, do you remember the next sentence? The next sentence right after that reads as follows, and if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Now there's the answer. Because since angels don't govern men, since it's not angels who hold public office but men, we do have to have external and internal controls. Now, external controls are the kind of thing that our Constitution has when we have rules of impeachment, when men misuse political power or exceed the power of their office, we impeach them. But there's a deeper answer to the question. Let me turn to the great books for a moment, to the Syntopicon, and read you from the Federalist Papers, Madison's statement. You all know, I'm sure, that our system of government supposedly is one of a division of the powers of government into three departments, executive, legislative, and judicial, with, as we say, a system of checks and balances. Now, that system of checks and balances, our founding fathers, men like Madison, learned from the great French political philosopher Montesquieu. Montesquieu had said, power should be a check to power. He had said, there can be no liberty where the legislative and the executive powers are united in the same person or body of magistrates. And Madison, James Madison, following him, said that this is the sacred maxim of free government. The preservation of liberty requires that the three great departments of government should be kept separate and distinct. And he went on to say that our Constitution, the Constitution of the United States, so contrives the interior structure of the government that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. Is the problem solved? Our founding fathers thought it was. They thought the Constitution, with its system of checks and balances, solved the problem. But they left a loophole through which power can pour and has poured more and more into the hands of men, so that in the 20th century we are faced with a more difficult problem. The second problem we want to consider, the problem of the power of government itself. How does that problem arise? It is through this loophole that the system of checks and balances does not stop up. What is it? Let me remind you of something for a moment. In absolute monarchy, or even in constitutional monarchy, the king is said to have certain prerogatives of government. In our system of government, the executive exercises certain prerogatives. What are the prerogatives of the executive branch? They are to do, when it is necessary to do so, the things that the general welfare of the country require, on which the law may be silent. They are to exercise emergency powers, with or without emergency grants of power from the Congress. Hence, it is on the side of governing beyond the law and outside the law that there's a loophole which increases the power of government itself. So we face this second problem. The problem is, How shall we limit not the power of men in government, but the power of government itself? And the general answer to that problem, so far as I know, is again indicated on the board. The only way you can limit the power of government by itself is by considering the purpose of government. Now, let's hold that idea before us. What is the purpose of government? Let's illustrate this for a moment by going to our own declaration, not a declaration, but to the Constitution of the United States and looking at the preamble. What purposes are there stated? To establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility. These two together are the end of government that I've been talking about for 2 weeks. Peace through justice. To provide for the common defense. That again is another aspect of peace, external peace now. To secure the blessings of liberty. This is justice again. This is that same thought that is contained in the other words of the Declaration. Governments are instituted to secure these rights, all of man's natural and unalienable rights and liberties. So far, all of these purposes stated in the preamble of the Constitution, I think, set a limited end to government, the one I have been calling the maintenance of civil peace through the administration of justice. But there's one more clause in the preamble, and that is the clause which throughout the history of the United States, and more so in recent years than before, has been the source of a change in our government. It is the so-called general welfare clause. For the words of the preamble say, among the purposes of our government, this one exists, to promote the general welfare. Now, the point about the general welfare is that it's an unlimited kind of purpose, as opposed to the very limited and well-defined purpose which consists in administering justice. And Alexander Hamilton calls our attention to what happens when a government has an unlimited purpose. Listen to Hamilton's words on this subject, because Hamilton's point is that the power of a government must be proportionate to its responsibility. His words are extraordinary. Let me read them to you carefully. Every power, he says, ought to be commensurate with its object. There ought to be no limitation of power destined to effect a purpose which is itself incapable of limitation. Now think about that for a moment. Is the welfare, the general welfare, capable of limitation? No, it's an almost infinite purpose or end. And if to promote the the general welfare or promotion of the general welfare is one of the great purposes of government, then how can you limit the power of government if Hamilton is right, that when you give a government the responsibility for an almost indefinitely large, unlimited end, you must also give them power is large, power proportionate. By the way, Lloyd, don't we have some questions on this problem of the general welfare that will help us along at this point?
Yes, I think there are two, if I can give them to you. Suppose I read them both. The first one I've chosen is from Mrs. William C. Smith, who lives in Los Altos, in California. She asks you, how far should government go in promoting the general welfare? She says the trend in government today seems to be almost a parent-child relationship, with the parent taking more and more responsibility for the child, and the child expecting more, of course, of the parent. And so is not this trend in government making children of us rather than mature people? And the second question is from Natalie Sosnick in San Jose. And she asks, Dr. Adler, when there is a conflict between two sovereignties, that is the state sovereignty and the federal government, under which Americans live, should the general welfare of the whole, that is the United States, the 48 states, supersede the general welfare of the part, the individual state, if that of the part is predominantly concerned?
Thank you, Lloyd. Those two questions, I think, are right on the problem we've been discussing, because Mrs. Smith's question calls attention to the fact that even when a democratic republic with a very good constitution, such as ours is, starts to pay primary attention to the general welfare, one result is a kind of paternalism on the part of government, which, as she says, tends to make children of us all. And the other question, Mrs. Sosnick calls our attention to the fact that we're a federal republic with some division of problems between the federal government and the states, and she raises the question as to what powers the federal government should have as opposed to the inferior corporations or the inferior units of government. Let me take these two questions and take them to the board once more to see if I can state the two sides of the issues they represent. Let's look at this problem once more. When the purpose of government is to serve only some of the ends for which men associate in society, government doesn't do the whole job. You have what is called the principle of political pluralism. In fact, this principle of political pluralism is Jefferson's principle, that a government should do as little as possible, meaning that thereby that other parts of society, private corporations, private associations, subordinate governments, local governments, should take some of the load of satisfying the purposes for which men associate and live together. Hamilton tends, on the other hand, towards strong government, taking as the end of government the promotion of the general welfare, letting government have that unlimited purpose. Hamilton tends to say, let the government be as strong as it has to be responsible for almost the whole reason of human association. As this gives rise to political pluralism and, I think, a free society, so at the other hand, the tendency towards government doing the whole job can't help but tending toward totalitarianism, or what in our day we call statism, and in another way, socialism. Now, it seems to me that Jefferson's principle here, that government governs best which governs least, and which allows, therefore, other parts of society to serve the needs of men when they associate together, is perhaps the sounder principle. Haven't we a question on this point? I recall, Lloyd, there is a question that someone asked us about the relation of Jefferson's principle to government.
Well, I think you have in mind Nick Diamond's
That's
question,
right, I do have that one, yes.
Yes, from Lodi. He asks you, isn't it true that the Republican Party supports the idea of that government rules least, rules best, as far as our national government is concerned, by giving more responsibility to the states and to the local governments?
Well, as a matter of fact, Mr. Diamond is, I think, just a little bit wrong about the two parties, or at least, if you take the whole of American history, Jefferson was the Democrat of his day, and yet the Jeffersonian principle of political pluralism tends to be in our day expressed by Herbert Hoover in the form of a rugged individualism, which his opponents often call a ragged individualism. Whereas Hamilton's principle, Hamilton was the Republican of his day, Hamilton's principle of strong government serving all the interests of society, particularly for the general welfare, tends to be espoused by a man like Franklin Roosevelt, who was a Democrat. But those two principles in opposition, whether in the 18th century and the 20th, represent the great conflict, which I should like to summarize for you now in the following way. Matter of fact, not so much the conflict itself as to say to you, in closing, that there is no satisfactory solution to this problem. Because, at least let me say, I think Jefferson's principle of a partial use of government to solve the problems of men is the right principle. But on the other hand, even though that's the right principle, it is opposed by sound prudence sometimes, for when the other organs of society aren't doing what must be done for the welfare of men, in education, in the handling of natural resources, in public health, in countless things that men need to have done for them. If private corporations or other human bodies, organizations, don't do this, then doesn't prudence require government to do what it has to do, even though that is more than it ought to do, by the right principle that government should do nothing more really than administer justice and keep the peace? So in this problem, we see a serious conflict between a sound principle on the one hand and sound prudence on the other. It is a very difficult problem to solve, and I doubt if we ever solve it. But let me just say one more thing going back to the blackboard. When justice is the end of government, and that is the main end, we tend toward political pluralism and even individualism. But when welfare, what W stands for here, is the end, we necessarily tend toward totalitarianism. And since in our day government has these two ends, both the administration of justice and the general welfare, we are in a continual tension between these two sides of the problem. Now next week, we will go on to the problem of the most just form of government, the best government. And I hope, even though it is Christmas week, you will think about this problem as our founding fathers fought to get the best government for us, and send us some questions, because we'd like next week to discuss this problem in the light of the questions you have raised for us. Thank you very much, and a Merry Christmas to all of you.